Hello and welcome to Chapter 11. I'm Chuck and I'm coming to you from Long Beach, California in my lovely and spacious hotel room. It's all white, so it looks kind of like I'm in heaven right now. So the topic for today is forms and PHP. And this lecture, except those parts that are from our textbook, the audio and the video and the slides, my parts at least, are copyright Creative Commons. So you should have by now PHP 11.zip and unzip that and put it in your PHP environment, and so you can see that I have the little files that you're using here. So this is form1.php, and so part of the key to running server-based stuff is that we have a place to send this data, and forms are one of the primary ways that we send data from the keyboard that we type on to the keyboard that we type on into the server. And so if we take a look at a typical form, right, it starts with a form and a /form tag, and label for, this is just a way for us to connect this text. This is more for screen readers. The input guess will come out on the screen. But then we have a little box, input guess, that says text box, name equals guess. This is how it's going to be sent into the server with the keyword value of guess. And the idea guess is just so that this label can reference it. And then we have an input type of submit, which renders as this little button. And so if we hit the submit button, we enter a guess right here. So we're putting a guess in, 12. And then we're going to hit the submit button, and then it submits and does a get request, because this form is doing a get request, and it takes the number, whatever number we put in this little square, and puts it up on the URL, retrieves the same URL with a question mark followed by guess equals 12. And that is a way to pass that information into a PHP script. Okay? So when we pass that information, whether it's a get or a post, that was a get because we didn't tell it to be a post, so that was a get. It passes that information into PHP, and PHP gathers all that information and creates a predefined array for both the get data and a predefined associative array for both the get data and the post data in the variables $_get and $_post. And so every variable in a form ends up in either the get or the post. The URL variables end up in the get, and the form post data, when we get to that, will be in there. There's another array called $_request, which merges those two things. And so, for example, if we add a little dump here, so here's our little thing, and we're going to say, okay, we're going to dump out, switch into PHP, and we'll dump out the get variable. And so the get variable is an array which has a key of guess and a value of 12. And so it's basically parsed all this, done all the figuring out of what the HTML and HTTP is, and given us an array. And so when we're writing our programs, when we want to get this data, whatever was typed into here, then we go grab it out of these arrays. So if we want to do post, now get versus post, the basic idea of get versus post, and I've covered this in a couple of the classes, and hopefully this is basically review. A get request is never supposed to modify data. You're only supposed to modify data in a post request. And a get request has potential for a limited URL length of, most people think 2,000 is a reasonable limit for URL length. It also, when you do a post, the data doesn't show up in the URL, so sometimes you want to not show the data in the user's browser. But probably the most important thing is never modify data in a get request. If you're going to modify data, it must be a post request. So if we want to take this form and make it do its data by a post, we say method equals post in here. And so when we put our 12 in here, or 42, or whatever we're putting in, we put in 42 and press submit, this data from this form with this key ends up in the post array instead of the get array. Now it turns out you can also put parameters on the URL as well, and you could, in some situations, have both data in the post array and data in the get array. But The more common thing, especially if you're modifying or creating or updating, is to use method equals post on the form and to look for your data in the $_post array. And that one is in form3.php. So if we're going to start writing our guessing game, and we'll start seeing a pattern here where if we're writing a script that's expecting some post data, we'll often process it at the very beginning, in effect before the first bit of HTML. And so this PHP doesn't emit any output. It just says I'm going to do the post processing of the post data here at the beginning. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a pattern that we'll see over and over and over again using the tertiary operator, where we're going to ask is set. It turns out if you just go grabbing stuff out of $_post under guess and it's not there, particularly because it was a GET request, maybe the first time that form 4 is being shown here, it'll blow up. Well, not blow up, but at least it'll warn you, and the warnings are kind of annoying. And there's a way to turn the warnings off, but the safe thing to do, the pattern that most people do, is first you ask, is $_post with guess key, does it exist? If it does, this is the ternary operator. The true side here is, if it's true, assign post guess into old guess, and otherwise it's a default value. So it's kind of like a Python get, where the quote, the empty string, is the default value that's going to go in here, and that's of course the false side of the ternary operator. Okay, so you're going to see this. Might as well just stare at this until you understand it, because I'm going to use it over and over again. You know, if we've got something in the post variable, then use it. If not, give some default value. You will see this pattern over and over and over again. So then we sort of finish. There's this sort of mystical line between the processing, the silent with no output processing of the incoming post data to the generation of the screen. Now, again, if this was a GET request, the first time it was shown, it would just come here and old guess would be empty string. We say guessing game, we print out our form, and so here we go. We have an input area, and in addition to all the other stuff that we're going to do here, we're going to say value equals. Now here we've lapsed into PHP. Okay, there's a couple ways we've lapsed into PHP, so now we're talking PHP. Echo value equals, this is going to be part of the HTML, double quote. You'll notice I'm using single quote strings here because this H is going to be part of the HTML, concatenated with the old guess, concatenated with another double quote, and then this right here is the end. This is the end of that input tag. Okay, so some of this input tag is coming from HTML, some of it's coming from this echo in PHP, and that's coming down to here. So that's the beginning and end of that tag. So the way what we're doing here is we want to show, when it's all said and done, we want the old guess to show up in the output of the program. Okay, so let me switch over and show you sort of how this works. Okay, so here we go. So this is form4.php running. That was a GET request. I just did a GET request, and now when I put my guess in, it's going to end up in the post array 41, and then when I submit it, this is a whole new screen. So this is the running of form4.php, except this time it has guess 41, and that little bit of code with old guess value equals, that ends up with 41 in here. So I'll do a quick view source of this. You can kind of see how this works, where here's the form, here's the input, that was the line, this is the part that came out of PHP. This is that old value coming, so the value double quote 41 came out of the PHP code. Let me make this a little bigger for the later ones. Okay, so that's what's going on here. So we're basically taking whatever that post data is, and we're sticking it between the double quotes in the value. Okay, now there's danger here, and this is something you got to be real careful about. Because we're literally just concatenating this stuff together, it's possible to put bad characters in here and sort of take over the HTML. And so let me put in some bad characters. Oh yeah, let me just do it. Boom. Let me just do it here. So what I'm going to do is, knowing that this is exactly literally being substituted, whatever I put in here, so if I put in like, I can put that in. And now if I do a view source, you see whatever I typed in that post field literally comes here. But what if I do something like this? If I say double quote, which that, oh yeah, because this isn't, well, this isn't going to work. So double quote, and then I can put some HTML in. I got to use a different browser here. Hang on, let me use a different browser. Come up, Firefox. This browser's too smart for what I'm about to do. Hang on. You got to use an older browser because some browsers stop this particular thing. Okay, hide that. So here we go, 41. It works. If I say quote, and then I close the input tag, that's what this does, I can run some JavaScript in this page, and you will see in a second what's about to happen. So you see this? That means there's JavaScript running, and that's because my input was not sanitized. As a matter of fact, this pre-tag. So if I do a view source, you can see what happens here. View page source. Make it bigger so you can see it. Okay. So here's what happened. From here to here was what I typed. Okay. And the browser saw the end of the value, the end of the input tag, and then this stuff was interpreted as code by the browser. This, of course, was a syntax. Oops. And it ran it, and it might do things like steal your credit card numbers or stuff like that. And then this was the rest of the stuff coming out, but this was just an HTML syntax error at that point. Okay, and so this is where this comes out. The browser goes, I don't know what you put that there for, but at that point it's taken over your browser. Okay, and so there's danger in not cleaning up your data, and that is there are certain characters that you shouldn't just concatenate into HTML coming out of PHP, and that's what happened here. The double quote was what I typed, and then that ended the input tag, and then I had my own HTML in here. This became a syntax error to the browser, but it didn't matter because at this point somebody outside your application has taken over. And again, the danger here is that in that they will do something like steal a session or steal credit card information or send you off to some other server or something like that. Okay, so that is what happens when you simply take literal text that the user typed and allow it to go into an HTML page that your application is producing. And so there is a function built right into PHP called HTML entities, and if you call HTML entities on that information, it will find those dangerous characters and it will put them in the alternate form using, ampersand, less than, semicolon. Oh, I can't draw very well. So for example, if we run this code again, and let's just run it again. If we run it in form 5, and I put in quote less than and then some bad JavaScript, and I hit submit query, oh, the pre-tag still is making the mistake. So the pre-tag down here was causing it to run. But let me view source and let me show you here. View page source. So what happened up here, make it larger. So what happened up here is that quote that was causing the trouble is ampersand quote, the less thans and greater thans. These are completely safe characters, and then it really goes all the way to the end of the double quote. And I can put all that stuff in, and you'll notice that this is like if this was my name or my address or something like that. It's like, okay, you can have a double quote in your name and address. Okay. Now I didn't fix it on the pre-tag. I should put an HTML entities around here, and so even in the pre-tag it's causing problems. And that's an interesting thing where even if you print some debugging stuff, if you don't surround it with HTML entities, the debugging stuff can let a bad user take over the browser of another user potentially. So the rule is, anytime you are putting data that ever came from the user right before you print it out, you wrap it in HTML entities, which then converts it to all the characters that might be dangerous to your HTML get converted to the ampersand form, which means they're not dangerous to HTML. So I mentioned this before. When there's many patterns for processing post data. There are no rules. This is a convention that you're going to see me follow for the rest of the class, and that is that I am going to break my PHP scripts that process post data into two halves, a top half and a bottom half. And in the top half, it's going to be silent, basically. It's going to be silently processing any post data. Now, on a GET request, it's just generally going to skip right down and then produce the page. Okay, so if it's a GET request, it produces the page because there is no post data. And you'll see typically what I'm doing is I'm doing an is set up here. We'll see more of this in larger so you can actually see the code. But this is silent. This top part is silent. It produces no output. And then it sets things up so that this page displays the right way. Okay, so if you're processing post data, so another way to do is don't process post data after this line. So process post data in a silent mode. Now some people will put the post code in a different file. There's all kinds of patterns, and you might even use a framework like Symfony or something like that. But this is a pattern that I'm going to use that I think is a good basic pattern that's reasonably clean of doing the silent processing of post data at the beginning and the setup of the page at the beginning, and then the actual display of the page in the second half. And don't fool with post data after this mystical line. And the mystical line is once you're starting to generate actual HTML. So here we go. We got this mystical line, and the top half looks like this. So the top half of the mystical line it's all PHP, and there is no prints or echoes or anything in here. It's doing things like handling incoming post data and setting variables to be used for later. Okay, so when it exits, when it passes this line, the guess variable, the message variable are all set the way I want. And so the code on this is pretty straightforward. It is, if I'm not going to really do anything, I'll set the guess to nothing and the message to display to false. But if there is post data, I will retrieve the guess from post data. Now here's a nifty trick that I like to use to clean up data that I know to be numbers, and that is to add 0 to them. So take the post sub guess, post under the key guess, and then add 0 to it, and remember that plus is a real aggressive type conversion operator. So that forces this to be an integer. So when you're all said and done, guess is going to be an integer. Now, if the guess is Fred or something, then that's going to be 0 because you can add a non-numeric string to 0 and it forces it to convert to 0. But it just means that you're not going to be dragging Fred around or something like that. It's going to convert it to an integer right then and there. So it's a way for me to clean up incoming data. And if they're, I could add more code if I wanted to put up an error message, but this is a quick way to convert that to an integer. Then I have a little bit of code. It says if the guess is 42, I say great job. If it's not 42, if it's lower, it's too low, too high. So none of this is producing output, but it is setting variables that are going to flow across this barrier. Okay, I guess this is in guess.php and PHP 11 file. And then if I look at what happens below the line, right? So here's the line, here's the line. If I look at what happens below the line, it's really generating output from the data that's been passed in. Okay, so there's data that flows across this line, and in this case, it's the $message variable and the $guess variable. And so here we're going to print out some stuff, and we're going to check to see if message is not equal to false. And if it's not, we're going to print it out. So that's the too high, too low, congratulations message. And then we're just going to cruise along, and we're going to take that guess, and we're going to wrap it in HTML entities. Now, some may debate whether or not you should wrap it in HTML entities at this point, because we know guess is an integer at this point. But some people will look at your code and say, you know what, that guess came from the user. I know it's a number, but let's just wrap it in HTML entities anyways. There's no harm to put it in HTML entities. So away we go. So again, this is this pattern where I put the logic at the top and then the display at the bottom. This is sort of a light version of what some people call a model view controller, and this is kind of like the model part, and this is the view in the controller down here. And so, but don't worry too much about that if model view controller doesn't make any sense to you. But I like this pattern. I don't like to split it into two. I like to keep my code relatively simple and keep it all together in one file, but I do like to have this split between the silent processing of incoming data and the generation of the screen. So this is how it works, and I talked that through already. In comes 100 as guess, and the variable guess and message come out, and then I already talked through all this stuff already. Okay, so let's talk a little bit. Now we're into the file more.php. Just some other input types. This is probably review for most of you that you pretty much know how these things work, but it's kind of nice sometimes to have a set of slides to go back to, or this more.php to go back to get like, oh, how the heck does a checkbox work? I know that I don't memorize these things very well at all. So we'll talk about these other things. We've already got text, password. So here is a sample of here's an input type text, input type password. Password is the same as text, you just don't see it, but the data is sent in plain text. Okay, and so here's in the text field, and one of the things I'm showing here is how this label and the ID are just used to connect to one another, and the name is what it goes into the server. So account, PW, and nick are the keys inside of the post associative array. The count is going to be Beth, the password is 12345, the nick is BK, and then there's more stuff. But so you see these things correspond one for one. It's the name parameter that puts them into what determines the key that they appear in the array. Okay, so that's multiple text, including a password style. But the password comes in plain, goes across the network plane. So it's just the only thing is someone watching over the shoulder. Some things I actually like. I'm have a little checkbox to switch between text and password. Like show me the password. No one's looking over my shoulder. They're hard enough to type. So because it's not really secured for anybody except watching you over your shoulder. And why can't they watch your keyboard if they're watching whatever? Never mind. Okay, here's a radio button. A radio button, of course, is a series of things, not just, it can have more than two, but only one can be selected. And so you basically have a series of radio buttons, and they don't actually even have to be near each other. It's kind of, maybe it's bad usability to have them scattered. And basically, they're tied together by all having the same name. Okay? And so one or the other is checked. This is a way in HTML to have a default checking, right? I want this one to be checked by default. You wouldn't have to have that. You could sort of, and you switch back and forth and you click one or the other and away they go. And basically there's also a value for each of the things, and this is what tells you inside of your program that, oh, when was checked, right? PM was checked because this value PM shows up in the input array. Okay, so that's radio button, checkbox. So a checkbox allows multiple things to be checked. Again, they're tied together with the same name with different values and then checked. And they come in again with that name. A select box, you can also have multi-selects. This one is one that has no default, so it defaults to the first one. The select name equals soda determines what value, what the key is within the post array, and then the value determines the value based on which one is selected right before the person hits the submit button. And here is one where you can also add a selected so that something other than the first is selected. It doesn't have to be numbers. The values can be strings. The values are whatever it is you want. I mean, you've got to write the code inside to handle the incoming data. Okay. Another one is the text area. So the text area is a little bit different in that the actual contents are between the text area and /text area tags rather than being a value equals. On all the rest of them, the default value is on the value equals. And this big long line, I've got it split here, but it just comes in as a big long string underneath the about. Another type is the submit, and the submit basically also has a name. You can have more than one submit, and you set them. You can tell the difference between which submit button was pushed by the name of it. So you have 2 or 3 submit buttons. The value, you can also have the same name but multiple values, but that's sort of seen as tacky, because often in a internationalized application you're going to change the string based on the language, if it's Spanish or whatever. So it's kind of tacky inside your program to look for the word submit or the Spanish word for submit or the French word for submit. And so it's easier to have more than one submit button and then give them different names and then look at the key name if it's set to say, oh, does this have a value, and then not exactly look at that string. Another pattern is to put something up that's not actually going to submit, but instead take some action. And so that's a type button. So here's escape. And what we do here typically is we have a JavaScript onClick that basically says run this JavaScript if it gets clicked. And this is going to say set the location of this browser to be HTTP blah 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 blah. And that's like typing that value into the browser and in the browser address bar. And then return false is a way to say, oh, and don't actually submit this form data to the original page. This is kind of like an href, a link, except it's in the form of a button and it looks like a button and it's styled like a button. And so this is kind of the way to turn a button into a hyperlink. So that was a quick run through sort of how forms connect with PHP and sanitizing HTML, and just a quick run through of the other input types. Probably the trickiest thing that I ignored was the multiple select capability.